Hello everybody, this is Mr. Jackson, and today we're going to be getting into Unit 2, Lesson 4, Part 1. This is where we're going to discuss a little bit of the background before we start discussing cells. So we're going to be discussing cell theory and the fact that life is cellular. So there are three fundamental parts to the cell theory. Okay, three things that make that up, and we need to remember these. The first one is that all living things are made up of cells. If you'll think back to your levels of organization and earlier discussions in the school year, we discussed that once you have a single cell, that meets all the criteria necessary to be considered living. And anything with more than one cell above that level is, of course, also living as well. So all living things are made of cells. We consider cells the basic unit of life. Again, that's when we start considering that level to be living. And then third, all cells come from other or pre-existing cells. Okay, so cells don't just randomly appear out of thin air. They will always come from pre-existing cells. And although living things are made up of cells, there's two ways that we can classify these organisms. We can classify them based on whether they have only one cell or whether they have multiple. So cells can be, or organisms can be unicellular, so single cell composed of only one cell. There's an arrow pointing to an example there that is a single-celled organism like a bacteria. And then you have multicellular, just means multiple cells, and this is composed of many cells. These can organize into those higher levels of organization, like cells coming together to form tissues, tissues coming together to form organs, organ systems, and so on. And obviously the puppy is an example of an animal or a multicellular organism. Okay, so cells are that most basic unit of life. It is the smallest part of an organism that we still say is capable of all of life's major processes. But given that, they are also very diverse, right? There are, a very high number of cells, different cell types, just within your body as human beings. So we have two additional categories, two big types of ways that we can classify these cells. We have prokaryotic and eukaryotic. Okay, so prokaryotic and eukaryotic, and we're going to explore some of the differences between those now. Okay, so prokaryotes. We're going to go through this chart real quick. I'm going to click each time and basically expose the differences that occur between these two major types of cells. Okay, and whenever we say prokaryotic, we're referring to single-celled organisms. Whenever we say eukaryotic, we're referring to multicellular organisms typically. So let's explore some of the differences. The first difference is that while prokaryotes do not have a nucleus to protect their genetic information, eukaryotic cells do. So typically you're going to find our genetic information neatly stored inside a nucleus. Whenever you consider different membrane-bound organelles, so little organelles that are their own thing, they're clearly divided from their surroundings, prokaryotes don't have that, and eukaryotes, of course, do. And we'll be exploring a bunch of those cell structures and their functions in Part 2. The way that cells divide, prokaryotes happen to divide in this process that we call binary fission. You do not have to remember that. Eukaryotes will divide in a process called mitosis, and we'll be looking into that as we move forward. The size of the organisms, as I've already said, prokaryotic cells are always unicellular. Eukaryotic cells can be uni or multicellular, so it can be one or more. Cell walls. Yes, the prokaryotes do have cell walls, as well as some eukaryotic cells. So certain fungi and plants will have cell walls as well. So that's a common point of similarity. And some examples of where we would find these. Prokaryotes are typically going to be your bacteria. Eukaryotic could be plants, animals, fungi, protists, but in this class, we're going to specifically focus on eukaryotic cells, and in this class, we're going to specifically focus on plants and animal cells. So, although there are two main types of cells, right, and we've just discussed all the ways in which they are different, all cells will have four key things in common. That is, they will both have genetic material, right? So you can see there's a green arrow here for the prokaryote. That genetic material is represented in purple within the cell. It's just not in a nucleus, right? But they still do have that DNA or RNA. And then our genetic material inside an animal cell is going to be nice and safe inside this nucleus. You have cytoplasm. We'll be getting into all the definitions of these different organelles as we go into part 2. But you just think of cytoplasm as this fluid substance surrounding all of your organelles within the cell. So they both have cytoplasm, marked here in yellow. They both have cell membranes, right? So they have outer boundaries that we call cell membranes. You can see that in orange on both cells. And then finally, they have ribosomes. Ribosomes are little protein factories, extremely important as we move forward. But for now, just kind of keeping in mind, we have all of these differences between prokaryotes and eukaryotes, and we have these four things here in common. So all cells will have these four things. And to wrap up our first part of lesson 4, we're going to be getting into, in part 2, organelles. So let's go ahead and define what we mean by that. So all cells have those four structures, but eukaryotic cells are going to also have membrane-bound organelles, right? And so these organelles are basically just specialized structures. They are within the cell, they work together, and they help the cell function. So each one of these organelles that we learn about moving forward, they have their own unique functions, their own contributions to the overall health and function of the cell. So you can think of these as kind of like, if the cell is like a body, then each of these organelles are kind of like little mini organs within the cell that work together for one main purpose. And that main purpose, as we've alluded to several times now, is to make proteins, right? That is the end-all, be-all. Proteins are how we function. They are the macromolecule of life. And so all of the organelles in your body are going to be towards that functionality. Important thing to remember that eukaryotes do technically include animals, plants, protists, fungi, but in this class moving forward, we're going to exclusively focus on plants and animal cells. And within that, probably even more so on the animal cells, because those are the ones that we as human beings possess. So that, at this point, is going to wrap up all of our essential information to get this lesson 4 started. Feel free to review as needed, and I hope this was helpful.